and welcome to another Hayley-Roxanna crafts video. I have recently cross-stitched on Evenweave fabric for the first time, and when I made the video last year about how to stitch on Evenweave fabric, I said that once I'd actually experienced doing this myself, I'd share some tips with you. So in this video I'm going to share some of the things that I learnt while cross-stitching on Evenweave for the first time, how I overcame some of the difficulties that I had, and things that I'd do differently next time I stitch on Evenweave fabric. So this is my first cross stitch on Evenweave fabric. This is a design from the It's Christmas Bookazine by Disney Cross Stitch magazine. And it was actually meant to be stitched on a plastic Ada and then put on a wreath with the other 7 Winnie the Pooh designs. But I decided that I wanted to stitch them on Evenweave. And then I will turn them into like a hanging decoration once I've completed them all. The first thing I noticed about using Evenweave fabric is how it frays so much easier than the Ada fabric. Normally when stitching a small piece like this on an Ada fabric, I wouldn't bother protecting the edges first because it doesn't take that long to stitch, and in the time using it, it wouldn't really fray much, as you can see from this piece of Ada that I've used for demonstrating on in my videos. However, if I use Evenweave fabric again, one of the things I would do is I would cut the fabric that I'm using larger than if it was being worked on an Ada fabric, just to allow for that extra bit of fraying. And I probably would also actually protect the edges even on a smaller piece, by either sort of putting masking tape on the edges like I have done on this piece of Evenweave that I've got prepped for a future project, and even just using like pinking shears to cut like they've done here. So set pinking shears like this, as I found that the edges that were cut with the pinking shears didn't fray quite as much, so that's another option I could look at. The zigzag cut seems to reduce the fraying. Or I could even just blanket stitch around the edges to protect them a little bit more. So yeah, those are the 3 options that I would consider when using Evenweave in the future. Another thing I noticed when stitching on the Evenweave is how much softer the fabric is compared to the Ada fabric. So if I just show you these 2 pieces, you can see just by looking that the Ada fabric is that bit stiffer, holds its shape a bit easier, whereas the Evenweave is flopping about. It's quite sort of soft. When stitching on Ada fabric, I normally just hold the fabric in my hand while I stitch, regardless of the size of the cross stitch, whether it's a small piece or a large piece. I'm normally quite comfortable holding it in my hand. But I think if I was stitching a larger piece on the Evenweave, I might need to use like a embroidery hoop, sort of like this. You can get them in different sizes, so if you were doing a smaller piece, you could use a smaller hoop that you just pop the fabric in, pop that over the top, and it just supports your fabric. Or even you can get like frames that do a similar thing. Yeah, I think I would have to use something like that to support my fabric if I was stitching a larger piece in particular. This would also help with making sure that the stitches were kept even, as this was something else that I found took a bit more care when stitching on the Evenweave. I found I had to pull the thread through a bit more carefully than what I do when I'm stitching on Ada fabric. And also, when I did make a mistake and needed to undo a bit of the stitching, I had to take a lot more care when I was undoing, so that I didn't distort the fabric at all, and sort of make it look a bit odd. Something else I found trickier when stitching on the Evenweave fabric compared to when I stitch on Ada fabric was counting between stitches, due to the way that you stitch over 2 squares when you're stitching on Evenweave fabric. So if I show you what I mean by the stitching over 2 squares, on this piece of fabric I've just done 1 cross and it goes over 2 squares. If you sort of look at the Aida fabric as being divided up into smaller squares. So if I show you, so if you come up the hole, what the next one, like so, whereas on Aida fabric you just go down the next hole diagonally, when stitching on Evenweave for a normal standard cross stitch you tend to go down the second one, like so. Okay, so as you cross that back, you come up like so, and then you skip the middle hole and go down into the corner one, as though you're sort of working on like a 3x3 grid of holes for each square on the pattern. I will link my previous video on stitching on Evenweave to show that in a bit more detail, but that's what I mean by stitching over 2. So when you're stitching, it makes it that little bit trickier for counting to where you next want to stitch if there's a gap between the stitches that you're doing, just because you've got the extra holes. It's not just as simple as just counting 1 hole to move across, so it does make it a bit harder. And the way I found to sort of overcome this issue was to make sure I didn't stitch too far away from where I'd already stitched. So if I take this one that I'm actually have started but haven't finished, this Pooh and Piglet design, I'll just pull the needle off so that I can point to things with it. So when I come to stitching like this background bit on this one, whereas normally if I was stitching on Aida fabric, I'd potentially start at the top here. I'd count up from the design I've done up to where the top is. That might be slightly tricky because of the way you'd have to count it. So I'd probably start with the background pretty much next to where I've already stitched. Just pick a point close to where I've already stitched and then maybe work up and then do the rest of the background working down, just to make it simpler and so you don't make an error in the counting, so you don't end up stitching in the wrong place. I also found I needed to concentrate more when stitching on Evenweave than when stitching on the Aida. This might be partly due to my lack of experience of stitching on Evenweave, but I found if my concentration lapsed, I tended to stitch in the wrong hole when forming the crosses. So I'd do things like, I'd come up in the right place, but then instead of keeping it on that diagonal to go across 2 like that, I'd probably put it in, I'd stick it in that hole by mistake. And I'd end up with crosses that looked sort of narrower than they should, or slightly distorted because I do it wrong the one way and right the other, like so, or I do it where I do the first part of the cross correctly and then as I was coming back I'd come up the correct hole, but then for some unknown reason I'd just go down into that one and end up with a distorted cross that I then have to be undone. Hopefully with more experience of stitching on Evenweave, this is something that I will get better at, making sure that I'm forming the crosses properly. But I also found ensuring I was in a well-lit area when stitching helped, and as did taking my time a little bit more than I usually would, just that little bit more care to make sure that I was doing my crosses correctly. Backstitching on the Evenweave fabric was something else that was slightly trickier for me than I find it on Aida fabric, which I think is also due to the extra holes that you've got. So instead of just having 4 holes in each square, equivalent to each square on your chart, you've got 9 holes. And I found the easiest way to do the back stitch was to actually just follow the crosses that were already there, rather than try to work it by square like I normally do. But again, I think this is just a case of taking a bit more time and care than I usually need to, just because I'm new to stitching on Evenweave. But yeah, following the crosses really helped with working out where to put the back stitch. So one advantage I did see for cross stitching on Evenweave over the Aida fabric was doing fractional stitches on Evenweave would actually be easier. The cross stitch I did, as you can see, it's only got 4 stitches in it. But if there had been fractional stitches, I wouldn't have needed to pierce the fabric like you do when stitching them on Aida fabric, because of working in that 3x3 grid for each square. So if I show you on here, doing a quarter stitch, you would literally just have to go down into the middle hole of your 3x3 grid of holes, like so. So depending on which way your stitch needed to be, depend on where you'd take it from into the middle, but the quarter stitches would be as simple as that, for example. And then obviously doing a 3/4 stitch, you'd have your full line which would go over the 2 holes like that, so the corner hole to the corner hole, in that 3x3 grid, and then the quarter to make it into the 3/4 would just go from the corner hole to the middle hole, depending on which direction you want it, but literally as simple as that. So no piercing of fabric required like there is on the Aida fabric. So that's everything I learnt cross stitching on Evenweave fabric for the first time. Overall, I enjoyed cross stitching on the Evenweave, and I will definitely complete the Winnie the Pooh designs that I've already started stitching, but personally I still prefer the Aida fabric. However, I would also like to complete more cross stitches on Evenweave to gain more experience of using it. If you have any tips for cross stitching on Evenweave fabric, please share them in the comments, and if you've got any questions, pop them there too, and I'll do my best to answer them for you. And that's everything. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye!